On the morning of July 10, 1942, machinist mate Albert Thach pressed his face against the cold window of a PBY Catalina flying boat, watching fog roll across the barren slopes of Akutan Island in the Aleutian chain. His pilot, Lieutenant William Thach, had been lost for the past hour, flying by dead, reckoning through weather so thick they couldn't see their own wingtips. They were supposed to be patrolling near Dutch harbour, but these had no idea where they were until Thach spotted the Shumagin Islands through a break in the clouds. Now they were cutting across Akutan, taking the most direct route back to base. That's when Thach saw it. A dark shape in a grassy valley, half a mile inland from Broad Bight. An airplane upside down, tail in the air, Japanese markings clearly visible even from altitude, a Zero fighter, intact. The aircraft that had been killing American pilots at a rate of 12-1 for the past 6 months. Thach circled twice to confirm what they were seeing. The Zero looked almost perfect. No major damage, just sitting there in the marsh grass, waiting. They marked the position on the map and turned for Dutch harbour. What neither of them knew was that they'd just found the most valuable intelligence prize of the entire Pacific War. An airplane that would reveal every secret the Japanese had been using to dominate the skies since Pearl Harbor. But getting that airplane off Akutan Island and into American hands would require 3 separate recovery attempts, 2 months of work, and a level of secrecy that would determine who lived and who died in every dogfight for the next 2 years. 6 months earlier, on December 8, 1941, the Japanese had struck the Philippines with devastating force. By the end of the first week, 37 American pilots were dead. The Zeros came out of nowhere, faster than anything the Americans had seen, more maneuverable than seemed physically possible. They could climb at 5,000 feet per minute. They could turn inside any maneuver an American fighter attempted. They had a range of over 1,500 miles, which meant they could escort bombers deeper into enemy territory than anyone thought possible. And they were flown by pilots who had been training for war since 1937, veterans of combat in China, where they'd shot down 99 Chinese aircraft while losing only 2 Zeros to ground fire. American intelligence had heard rumors about this airplane. Reports from China mentioned a fighter with extraordinary performance, but most commanders thought the reports were exaggerated. Japanese aircraft were supposed to be inferior copies of Western designs, cheap, poorly made. That's what the training manuals said. The manuals were catastrophically wrong. When the Zeros hit Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, 78 of them flew in the first wave. American fighters that managed to get airborne were simply outclassed. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk couldn't climb with a Zero. The Brewster F-2A Buffalo couldn't turn with it. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was tougher, but slower and less agile. Pilots who tried to dogfight the Zero died. In the skies over the Philippines during those first terrible weeks, American pilots learned hard lessons. Captain Jesus Villamore, flying an obsolete P-26 pea-shooter, watched Zeros tear through his formation. He survived only by diving away at full throttle. Lieutenant Randall Keaton got the first confirmed American kill against a Zero on December 8th, but his squadron lost 11 aircraft that same day. At Clark Field, 18 P-40s sat on the runway when the Japanese bombers arrived. All 18 were destroyed on the ground. The pilots never got airborne. By January 1942, the official American tactic was simple and humiliating. If you encounter a Zero, run away. Dive for the deck. Use your heavier aircraft's better dive, speed, and get out of the fight. Don't try to turn with it. Don't try to climb with it. Just run. And even that didn't always work. Over Java in February 1942, Allied pilots flying Hurricanes and P-40s faced Zeros in battle after battle. The kill ratio was devastating. For every Zero shot down, the Allies lost 10 aircraft. At Darwin, Australia, on February 19, 1942, a single raid by Japanese bombers and Zeros destroyed 23 Allied aircraft. The Zero seemed invincible. Pilots returning from combat described it with almost mystical reverence. It could turn on a dime. It could climb like a rocket. It could stay in the air for hours. Some pilots claimed the Zero had no weaknesses at all, but one man refused to accept that the Zero was unbeatable. Lieutenant Commander John Thach was commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3 VF3, based out of San Diego in early 1942. He'd been an aviator since 1930, a test, pilot and gunnery instructor. He was known for tactical thinking, for spending his evenings working through combat scenarios using matchsticks on his kitchen table to represent aircraft formations. In the spring of 1941, Thach received an intelligence bulletin describing the Zero. The report came from the Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin, published September 22, 1941. It detailed everything the Japanese fighter could do: extraordinary maneuverability, 5,000 feet per minute climb rate, small turning radius. The Wildcat he was flying couldn't match any of it. Thach spent every evening for weeks trying to figure out a tactical solution. The standard American fighter formation was 3 aircraft, a leader and 2 wingmen. It had been used since World War I. But Thach realized that formation required pilots to spend too much attention watching their leader and not enough watching for threats. He switched to a 2-plane element, a leader and wingman flying side by side, separated by about the turning radius of a Wildcat. 2 of these elements made a 4-plane division. When one element got jumped by a Zero, both elements would turn toward each other. The Zero pilot would line up a shot on one element, then suddenly find himself facing 2 Wildcats coming straight at him from the opposite direction. If he pressed his attack, he'd fly into a head on engagement. If he broke off, the other element would get on his tail. Thach called it the beam defense position. His pilots called it something else, but they practiced it anyway. In May 1942, Thach arranged for aircraft with better performance than Wildcats to play the role of attacking Zeros in training exercises. The beam defense worked. Every single practice engagement. The attackers couldn't get a clean shot. The defending Wildcats always ended up in firing position, but Thach had never tested it against real Zeros. He'd get that chance at Midway. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led 12 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers on an attack run against the Japanese carrier fleet northeast of Midway Island. Massey was the commanding officer of Torpedo Squadron 3, VT-3. Thach and 6 Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3 were flying escort at 1,500 feet above the torpedo bombers. They were supposed to protect Massey's flight from Japanese fighters. But when the torpedo bombers started their attack, run shortly after 0800 hours, 20 Zeros dove out of the sun and tore into the formation. Thach's division of 4 aircraft, including himself, his wingman Ensign Robert Dibb, Lieutenant Brainard Macomber, and Ensign Edgar Bassett, tried to engage. Bassett's Wildcat was hit immediately. The Zero pilot put a burst into Bassett's fuselage. The Wildcat slanted toward the water and exploded. Thach called for Dibb and Macomber to follow him into the beam defense. They turned toward each other. A Zero lined up on Macomber. Thach turned hard toward Macomber, and Dibb followed. The Zero pilot saw Thach coming head-on but committed to his attack anyway. Thach squeezed the trigger. His 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon hammered out a 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage. Pieces flew off. The Zero's engine erupted in flames and the aircraft fell away, trailing black smoke. First kill using the beam defense. But there were 19 more Zeros and only 3 Wildcats left. Dibb called that he had a Zero on his tail. Thach turned toward him. Dibb turned toward Thach. They crossed paths. The Zero pilot tried to follow Dibb through the turn and flew right into Thach's firing cone. Thach hit him with a head-on burst. The Zero shed part of its engine, cowling, and burst into flames. Second kill. They kept weaving, back and forth. Every 20 to 30 seconds, another Zero would attack. Every 20 to 30 seconds, the weave would position one of the Wildcats for a deflection shot. Macomber's radio was out. He couldn't hear Thach's instructions, but he stayed in formation and followed the turns. The 3 Wildcats survived 17 minutes of continuous combat against 20 Zeros. Thach shot down 3 confirmed kills. Dib got 1. They lost 1 Wildcat, but Massey and all 12 Devastators were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. Massey died in the attack. His wingman died. Every pilot in the squadron died. The beam defense position worked, but it required pilots to know the tactic, to practice it, to trust it. Most squadrons had never heard of it. And even when it worked, American pilots were still just surviving, not winning. What American pilots needed wasn't just better tactics. They needed to know the Zero's weaknesses. They needed to understand how it performed at high speeds, how it rolled, how it handled under negative G forces. They needed test data, actual flight characteristics from an intact Zero. And while Thach was fighting for his life at Midway, that Zero was about to crash on Akutan Island, 4,500 miles to the north. The pilot's name was Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga. He was 19 years old, born September 10th, 1922, in rural Japan, son of a carpenter, small for a pilot, barely 5 feet tall. But he'd passed flight training and had been assigned to the carrier Ryuho, flying Zero serial number 4593. The aircraft had left the Mitsubishi Nagoya factory on February 19, 1942, only 3.5 months old, nearly brand new. On June 4th, Koga launched from the Ryujo as part of a 3-plane section. His section leader was Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo. His other wingman was Petty Officer Tsuguo Shikada. Their target was Dutch Harbor, a naval base on Unalaska Island in the Aleutians. The attack was part of a diversionary operation during the Battle of Midway. The Japanese hoped to draw American naval forces north, while their main carrier strike force hit Midway Island from the west. It was a strategic feint, and Koga's section was part of the deception. They would strike Dutch Harbor hard enough to make the Americans think a major invasion was coming through the Aleutians. Koga's section attacked Dutch Harbor shortly after 0800 hours on June 4th, strafing and bombing American installations. The base was lightly defended, but the Americans fought back with everything they had. Members of the 206th Coast Artillery Regiment fired 50-caliber machine guns at the attacking Zeros. Sailors on ships in the harbor added their own fire. Small arms rounds filled the air. Most missed, but some didn't. During one of his passes, Koga's Zero took several hits. Small arms fire, probably 50-caliber rounds. One bullet severed his main oil line. The line ran from the oil cooler back to the engine. Without it, his engine would lose all its oil within minutes. Koga saw the oil pressure gauge dropping. He could see oil streaming behind his aircraft, leaving a dark trail in the sky. His engine temperature was rising. Within 5 minutes, maybe less, the engine would seize and the aircraft would fall. He radioed his section leader and headed southwest toward Akutan Island. The Japanese had designated Akutan as an emergency landing site. A submarine was stationed offshore to pick up downed pilots. The island had what looked like a long, flat, grassy valley 1/2 mile inland from the coast. From altitude, it looked perfect for an emergency landing. A long stretch of green, smooth, solid, or so it appeared. Koga circled the valley once. His engine was running rough now, temperature climbing, oil pressure nearly 0. He had maybe 2 minutes before the engine quit completely. Shikada, his wingman, circled with him. On the second pass, Shikada noticed something. The grass looked odd. There was a shine to it. Water reflecting sunlight. He suddenly realized what he was seeing. It wasn't solid ground. It was a bog. Marsh hidden beneath knee-high grass. Shikada tried to signal Koga. Make a belly landing. Keep the gear up. But Koga's engine was failing. He had his landing gear down, his flaps down. He was committed to a wheels-down landing. There was no time to reconfigure. Koga's wheels touched the grass shortly after the attack on Dutch Harbor ended. They sank immediately into the mud. The Zero's momentum carried it forward. The wheels dug deeper. The tail came up. The aircraft flipped violently, throwing up a cloud of water and mud and grass. It came to rest upside down, the tail pointing skyward, the engine buried in the bog. Koga was still strapped in the cockpit, hanging upside down from his harness. The impact broke his neck. He died instantly. The shock of deceleration when the wheels caught in the mud had snapped his head forward with lethal force. Koga's wingmen circled overhead. Endo and Shikada watched the crash. They saw the Zero flip. They saw it come to rest, inverted. They couldn't see Koga. They didn't know if he was alive or dead. Japanese pilots had standing orders to destroy any Zero that crashed in enemy territory. The orders were explicit and unambiguous. Strafe the wreckage. Burn it. Make it unusable. Don't let the Americans capture an intact Zero. The Americans had been trying to get their hands on a flyable Zero since the war began. Every crashed Zero had been studied, but all had been too damaged. This one looked almost perfect. Just upside down. If Koga was alive, strafing the airplane would kill him. Endo and Shikada couldn't see any movement, no sign of life, but they couldn't be certain. They circled for several minutes, waiting, hoping to see Koga climb out. Nothing. The submarine was waiting offshore. They had to leave before American aircraft arrived. Japanese fighters were low on fuel. The attack was over. They had to return to the Ryujo. Endo and Shikada made a decision. They left the Zero intact and flew back to their carrier. They'd failed to follow their orders. They knew the consequences. They knew an intact Zero in American hands would be catastrophic for Japan, but they couldn't bring themselves to kill their friend. That moment of compassion, that human decision, would change the course of the Pacific War. The crash site remained undisturbed for 36 days. Akutan Island is one of the most remote places on Earth. Barren. Volcanic, almost always covered in fog. The Aleutian Islands have some of the worst weather in the world. Rain, fog, wind, and cold. The valley where Koga crashed was out of sight of standard flight paths. Ships passing the island couldn't see inland. The terrain blocked the view. The Zero sat there through June, through the first week of July, slowly sinking deeper into the bog. Rain fell. Fog rolled through. The Zero settled into the mud, but remained largely intact. The inverted position actually helped preserve it. The engine and cockpit were protected from the elements. On July 10, 1942, Lieutenant William Thies and his PBY crew spotted the Zero by pure chance. They'd been lost in the fog. Only found the wreckage because they cut across the island instead of flying around it. The next day, July 11th, a recovery team flew out to assess the situation. Lieutenant Robert Kerms led the team. They landed on the coast and hiked half a mile inland through rough terrain. When they reached the crash site, they found Koga's body still in the cockpit, hanging upside down from his harness. They pulled him out carefully. His neck was clearly broken. They could see the angle was wrong. They dug a grave on a nearby knoll overlooking the valley. They had no chaplain, but they gave Koga as proper a burial as circumstances allowed. They marked the grave with stones. Then they examined the Zero. Kerms walked around the aircraft slowly, taking notes. The airframe was intact. The wings showed no major damage. The tail was straight. The fuselage had a few bullet holes from the Dutch harbour attack, but nothing catastrophic. The engine appeared undamaged. The three-blade Sumitomo propeller was bent from the impact but repairable. The landing gear was sheared off when the wheels caught in the bog. The vertical stabilizer was bent. The rudder was twisted. The wingtips were scraped. The flaps were damaged. The canopy was cracked. But overall, the aircraft was in remarkable condition. This Zero could fly again. Kerms reported back to Dutch harbour immediately. The Navy moved fast. They dispatched a salvage team with heavy equipment. But nature fought back. The ship carrying the lifting equipment lost 2 anchors trying to hold position in the brutal Aleutian currents. Tides in the Aleutians can change 15 feet in 6 hours. Winds regularly exceed 50 miles per hour. The recovery team couldn't move the Zero. It weighed over 5,000 pounds and was stuck deep in the mud. The bog held it like a vice. They had to leave it and try again. On July 15th, a third recovery team arrived with better equipment. They brought a portable crane, cables, and a barge. They worked for 2 days in miserable conditions, cold rain. Fog so thick they could barely see 20 feet. The mud was like glue. They rigged cables under the Zero's fuselage. The crane strained. The cables went taut. Slowly, the Zero began to move. Mud sucked at the airframe. There was a wet, tearing sound as the aircraft pulled free. They hauled it upright. Water and mud poured out of the cockpit and engine cowling. They let it drain, then began the arduous task of moving it overland to the coast. They had to build a temporary road through the marsh. They laid down wooden planks. They dragged the Zero inch by inch. It took them another full day to reach the barge. At Dutch Harbour, they turned the Zero right side up and cleaned off the worst of the mud. The aircraft was filthy but salvageable. They loaded it into the cargo hold of the USS St. Mihiel, a transport ship. The Zero was wrapped and secured. Armed guards stood watch. Nobody could know what was in the hold. The St. Mihiel sailed for Seattle on July 20th. The voyage took 12 days through rough North Pacific seas. The ship arrived in Seattle on August 1st. From there, the Zero went by barge to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. North Island had secure facilities and some of the Navy's best aircraft mechanics. When the Zero arrived at North Island on August 12th, the Navy erected a 12-foot-high stockade around it inside a hangar. Armed Marines stood guard 24 hours a day. Nobody was allowed near the aircraft without written authorization from the base commander. The threat of souvenir hunters was real. One stolen part could compromise the entire intelligence operation. The put-to mechanics worked in total secrecy. They documented every part removed. They measured every dimension. They photographed everything. They straightened the vertical stabilizer carefully, checking for metal fatigue. They repaired the rudder, ensuring it moved freely through its full range. They replaced the wingtips with fabricated pieces that matched the original specifications. They fixed the flaps, testing the hinge points. They manufactured new landing struts to replace the ones sheared off in the crash. The original 3-blade Sumitomo propeller was bent, but they dressed it carefully and reused it. They patched the bullet holes from Dutch Harbour, filling them with aluminum patches. They repainted the original red Hinomaru roundel with American blue circle white star insignia. The entire repair process took 6 weeks of careful work. On September 20th, 1942, 2 months and 16 days after Koga crashed on Akutan, the Zero was ready to fly. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders would be the test pilot. Sanders was 31 years old. He'd been a Navy test pilot since 1938, assigned to Naval Air Station Anacostia in Washington. He was known for precision and technical analysis. Not flashy, not an ace. Just a methodical pilot who understood aircraft systems and could articulate what he felt in the controls. The Navy needed someone who could fly the Zero and extract every bit of technical data from it. Sanders was the right man for the job. On September 20th at 0900 hours, Sanders climbed into the Zero's cockpit for the first time. The cockpit was cramped, much smaller than a Wildcat. Sanders was not a large man, but even he felt squeezed. The seat was hard, the cushioning minimal. Japanese pilots were selected partly for their small stature. A pilot over 5'8" would struggle to fit. The instrument panel was simple compared to American aircraft. Engine gauges on the left, tachometer, manifold, pressure, oil temperature. Flight instruments in the center, airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon, turn and bank indicator. Everything else was on the right. Fuel gauges, hydraulic pressure. All the labels were in Japanese. Sanders had studied translations, but it still felt alien. He found the throttle, the mixture control, the propeller pitch lever, the landing gear handle, the flap control. Everything was where it should be, just laid out differently. Sanders started the Nakajima Sakai engine. The engine coughed once, caught, and settled into a smooth idle. The sound was different than an American engine, higher pitched. The propeller arc was visible in the morning Sunday. The aircraft vibrated, but differently than a Wildcat. Lighter, less substantial. The whole airframe felt delicate. Sanders checked the gauges. Oil pressure normal. Temperature rising slowly. Fuel pressure good. He advanced the throttle slightly. The engine responded immediately. Crisp. No hesitation. He released the brakes and taxied toward the runway. The Zero rolled easily. The tailwheel steering was light and responsive. Too light, almost. It would take getting used to. Sanders lined up on the runway. He advanced the throttle smoothly. The Zero accelerated quickly. Very quickly. The light weight meant rapid acceleration. At 60 knots, Sanders pulled back on the stick. The Zero leaped into the air. The takeoff roll was remarkably short, maybe half what a Wildcat needed. Sanders retracted the landing gear. The gear came up with a solid thunk. He raised the flaps. The Zero climbed steeply. Climb rate was immediately apparent. The Zero was climbing at over 4,000 feet per minute, maybe closer to 5,000. It was extraordinary. Sanders leveled off at 5,000 feet and began testing basic handling. He flew straight and level. The Zero tracked well. It was stable. The controls felt light but precise. At low speeds, the aircraft felt alive, responsive. He tried a gentle turn. The Zero snapped into the turn with almost no effort. The roll rate at low speed was impressive. He reversed direction. Again, the Zero responded instantly. Sanders pushed the airspeed up. At 150 knots, about 170 miles per hour, the controls still felt normal. Light, precise, responsive. At 180 knots, he felt the ailerons stiffen slightly. Just a hint of resistance. At 200 knots, 230 miles per hour, the ailerons froze. Sanders tried to roll the aircraft. He pushed the stick hard to the right. The ailerons barely moved. It felt like the control surfaces were locked. He had to use both hands and significant force just to get a slow roll started. The fabric-covered control surfaces were ballooning with air pressure at high speeds. They were becoming rigid, immovable. At 250 knots, it was physically impossible to roll the Zero at any useful rate. A pilot could push with all his strength and get maybe a few degrees of bank per second. In combat, that was nothing. An American pilot in a Wildcat or Corsair could roll hard, right or left at high speed. And the Zero couldn't follow. Sanders made careful notes. This was critical. Everything changed above 200 knots. Sanders tested roll rate in both directions. The Zero rolled to the left more easily than to the right. There was a definite asymmetry, about a 20% difference, probably related to engine torque and propeller rotation. The engine turned clockwise as viewed from the cockpit. That created a rolling moment to the left. With fabric control surfaces that couldn't overcome the aerodynamic forces at high speed, the torque effect became more noticeable. A Zero rolling left had a slight advantage. A Zero rolling right was at a disadvantage. American pilots could exploit that. If a Zero was on your tail, roll hard right. The Zero pilot would have an even harder time following. Then, Sanders tested negative G maneuvers. He climbed to 10,000 feet. He pushed the nose down into a dive, building speed. At 250 knots, he pulled back hard on the stick, then pushed forward abruptly to unload the wings. 0G, then negative 1G, then negative 2G. The engine coughed, sputtered, nearly quit. Sanders felt the power drop away. The propeller kept windmilling, but the engine was producing almost no thrust. He pushed the nose down, bringing positive Gs back. The engine caught again. Power returned. He tried it again. Same result. The Zero's engine used a float-type carburetor. Under negative acceleration, the float valve couldn't maintain fuel pressure. The carburetor starved. The engine quit. If an American pilot pushed his aircraft into a dive with negative Gs, the Zero following him would lose power and fall behind. That single weakness could save countless lives. Sanders flew for 90 minutes on that first flight. He tested climbs, dives, turns, stalls, and slow flight. He documented maximum speed, which was about 330 miles per hour. Respectable, but not exceptional. The Wildcat was nearly as fast. The new Corsair and Hellcat would be faster. He tested rate of climb, which was extraordinary, over 4,000 feet per minute from sea level to 10,000 feet. The Zero could outclimb anything America had flying. He tested turn radius at various speeds. At low speeds, the Zero could turn incredibly tight, tighter than any American aircraft. But above 200 knots, the turn radius opened up considerably. The controls became too heavy to execute sharp turns. Sanders landed after 90 minutes. He taxied in and shut down. A crowd of officers and engineers waited by the hangar. Everyone wanted to hear what he'd discovered. Sanders climbed out of the cockpit. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands ached from fighting the controls at high speed. He walked straight to the commanding officer. His first words were simple. He told them he'd found critical weaknesses that American pilots could exploit. The ailerons froze at speeds above 200 knots. Rolling maneuvers at high speeds were slow and required enormous force. The Zero rolled to the left easier than to the right. The engine cut out under negative acceleration. They now had answers. Real, actionable intelligence. Sanders flew 24 test flights between September 20th and October 15th. Each flight revealed more data. He tested the Zero against a Wildcat in mock combat. The Wildcat pilot tried every maneuver. At low speeds, the Zero dominated completely. It could turn inside the Wildcat every time. But when the Wildcat used speed, diving attacks, and high-speed reversals, the Zero couldn't follow. The tables turned completely. Sanders tested armament. The Zero had two 7.7mm machine guns in the nose and two 20mm cannons in the wings. The machine guns were rifle caliber, inadequate against armored American aircraft. The cannons were effective but had limited ammunition, only 60 rounds per gun. A few seconds of firing and they were empty. The trigger was mounted on the throttle, not the control stick. An unusual design. Sanders found it awkward. He tested visibility. The canopy provided excellent visibility in most directions, better than a Wildcat. But there was a large blind spot behind and below. The headrest blocked the view. An American pilot diving from above and behind could stay in that blind spot until the last second. Sanders tested durability. The Zero's construction was extremely light. The aluminum skin was thinner than American standards. There was no armor around the cockpit, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A few 50 caliber rounds in the right place could cause catastrophic damage. The Zero was designed for performance, not survivability. It was a knife fighter, deadly if it got close, but fragile. Sanders documented everything in his official report. He wrote that the very first flight exposed weaknesses American pilots could exploit with proper tactics. He described the aileron freeze at speeds above 200 knots. He explained the asymmetric roll rate. He detailed the carburetor problem under -G. He provided specific recommendations. American pilots should avoid turning fights at low speeds. They should use diving attacks from altitude, building speed past 250 knots. They should make a single firing pass, then zoom back to altitude using speed and climb rate. They should use -G dives to escape if a Zero got on their tail. They should roll hard right, as the Zero couldn't follow that direction as easily. At about 200 knots, they should roll hard before the Zero pilot could get his sights lined up. Sanders's report was classified top secret and distributed to fighter squadrons throughout the Pacific Fleet. But reading a report was one thing. Seeing it was another. The Navy decided to conduct live demonstrations. Lieutenant Melvin Hoffman was assigned to fly the Zero in mock combat against newly trained pilots. Hoffman was a test pilot stationed at Naval Air Station Anacostia. His call sign was Boogie. He'd been flying Wildcats since 1941. In late October 1942, Hoffman received orders to conduct dogfighting demonstrations using the captured Zero. The Navy wanted to train pilots using the actual aircraft they'd be fighting, show them exactly how to exploit the weaknesses Sanders had discovered. The demonstrations were held over San Diego Bay throughout late 1942 and into 1943. Each engagement was designed to test specific tactics. The first demonstration showed low-speed turning fights. Hoffman flew the Zero against 4 Wildcat pilots who'd just completed training. The Wildcats tried every maneuver they knew. Hoffman stayed on their tails through every turn. The Zero was simply too maneuverable at low speeds. One by one, the Wildcats would have been shot down. The student pilots watched Hoffman outmaneuver them effortlessly. They learned the lesson viscerally. Don't dogfight a Zero at low speeds. You'll lose every time. The second demonstration showed high-speed diving attacks. The Wildcat pilots started at 10,000 feet. Hoffman in the Zero started at 5,000 feet. The Wildcats rolled inverted and dove, building speed past 250 knots. Hoffman tried to follow. He rolled the Zero, or tried to. The students watching from the ground saw Hoffman struggling with the controls. The Zero's roll was painfully slow. The Wildcats completed their dives, pulled out at 2,000 feet, and zoomed back to altitude. Hoffman was still trying to get the Zero pointed downward. By the time he rolled in, the Wildcats were already climbing away. The students understood immediately. Hit the Zero fast. Don't slow down. Use speed as your weapon. The third, the demonstration showed the negative G escape. A Wildcat pilot let Hoffman get on his tail in the Zero. Hoffman closed to firing range. From the ground, it looked like the Wildcat was finished. Then the Wildcat pilot pushed over hard into a dive, unloading the wings, -2 Gs. Hoffman tried to follow. The Zero's engine coughed, sputtered, and quit. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Hoffman fell behind, trying desperately to restart the engine. The Wildcat pilot extended the range, brought the nose up, restored positive Gs. The Zero's engine caught and restarted, but by then, the Wildcat was 2,000 feet away and climbing. The students watched the smoke trail from Hoffman's engine. They saw how quickly the Zero lost power. They understood. If a Zero gets on your tail, push over hard, use -Gs. The Zero can't follow. The demonstrations continued for months. Hundreds of pilots rotated through the training program. Each one flew against Hoffman in the captured Zero. Each one saw the Zero's weaknesses demonstrated in actual flight. Each one learned the tactics that would keep them alive. Pilots who went through the training talked about it constantly. They described what they'd seen. They explained the tactics. By early 1943, word had spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. The Zero had weaknesses. Specific, exploitable weaknesses. Don't turn with it at low speeds. Attack from high altitude with speed. Roll hard right at high speeds. Use -Gs to escape. The tactics worked. Marine Corps pilot Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walsh went through the training in early 1943. Walsh would go on to shoot down 21 Japanese aircraft during the war. Years later, he credited the Akutan Zero training with saving his life multiple times. He said knowing what to do with a Zero on his tail, information that came from Koga's Zero, saved his life several times. Other pilots echoed his too. Assessment. The captured Zero was a treasure. No other captured machine had ever unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great. In January 1943, American pilots began shooting down Zeros at rates that shocked Japanese commanders. The kill ratio started shifting. In July 1942, before the Akutan Zero was tested, the ratio had been 12 Japanese kills for every 1 American loss. By March 1943, 4 months after the training demonstrations began, the ratio was nearly even. By June 1943, American pilots were killing more Zeros than they were losing. The change wasn't because of better aircraft, although new planes were arriving. The Wildcat was still the primary fighter in many squadrons. The change was because of knowledge. American pilots understood how the Zero performed. They knew when it was dangerous and when it was vulnerable. They could predict what a Zero pilot would do and counter it effectively. What the Japanese didn't understand was why their tactics were failing. Zero pilots had been using the same combat techniques since 1937. They'd worked perfectly in China. They'd worked at Pearl Harbor. They'd worked in the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, in Burma, over the Coral Sea. Suddenly, in early 1943, those techniques stopped working. American pilots were avoiding turning fights. They were attacking from altitude with high-speed dives. They were rolling away at speeds where the Zero couldn't follow. Japanese pilots tried to adapt. They tried tighter turns, hoping to force the Americans into slow-speed engagements. But American pilots refused to turn. They'd attack, then extend range using speed and altitude. No matter what bait the Japanese offered, the Americans wouldn't take it. Japanese pilots tried aggressive pursuit, closing the range before the Americans could dive away. But American pilots used negative G dives that somehow caused problems for pursuing Zeros. The Japanese pilots couldn't understand why their engines were cutting out. They knew to avoid negative G maneuvers in general, but they didn't have specific data about fuel pressure loss. They didn't understand the carburetor mechanism. They just knew that pursuing a diving American fighter sometimes resulted in power loss at the worst possible moment. Japanese pilots tried to compensate for poor high-speed roll rate by anticipating where Americans would go. But American pilots varied their escape directions unpredictably. Sometimes left, sometimes right, sometimes straight down with negative Gs. There was no pattern to exploit. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was they were fighting an enemy who understood their aircraft better than they did. American pilots knew the exact speed where the Zero's ailerons would lock up, 200 knots. They knew the roll rate degraded asymmetrically, easier left, harder right. They knew about the carburetor issue under negative Gs. They'd seen it demonstrated. They'd practiced against it. Japanese pilots had general knowledge. They knew the Zero handled poorly at high speed. But they didn't have numbers. They didn't have a performance envelope chart showing exactly where the weaknesses appeared. American pilots did. That knowledge gap was created by one intact Zero sitting in a hangar in San Diego, and it was killing Japanese pilots every single day. Japanese intelligence officers examined wreckage from downed American fighters. They documented improvements in American aircraft. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service in early 1943. It was faster than the Zero, more heavily armed, and could take more damage. The Vought F-4U Corsair was even faster, with better high-altitude performance. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had twin engines and could outrun anything at high altitude. Japanese analysts concluded that American aircraft technology had ATETET, surpassed the Zero. Better planes were beating their fighters. That was partly true. The new American aircraft were superior. But the real advantage wasn't just the aircraft. It was the tactics. Pilots flying the older Wildcats were also killing Zeros at improved rates. The tactics worked regardless of aircraft type. The knowledge worked against all Zeros. On January 12, 1944, First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, a Marine Corps pilot flying an F-4U Corsair from Vella La Vella, shot down 5 Zeros in a single mission. He used the high-speed attack tactics developed from the Akutan Zero data. Dive from altitude, build speed past 250 knots, make a single firing pass, zoom back to altitude, never turn. Never slow down. Never give the Zero a chance to use its superior low-speed maneuverability. Over the next 17 days, Hansen shot down 15 more Zeros using the same tactics. 20 kills in 17 days. The Zero had gone from the most feared fighter in the Pacific to target practice for pilots who knew its weaknesses. By mid-1944, Japanese losses to American fighters were catastrophic. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19th and 20th, 1944, resulted in the loss of approximately 650 Japanese aircraft against 123 American aircraft. Most of the Japanese losses were Zeros and other carrier aircraft. The battle took place over the Philippine Sea near Guam. American fighter pilots, flying F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, slaughtered Japanese formations using tactics that exploited every weakness the Akutan Zero had revealed. Experienced Zero pilots who survived the early war were being killed by American pilots with only a few months of combat experience. The Americans weren't better pilots inherently, they just had better information. The Akutan Zero remained at North Island through 1943, flying regular demonstration missions. In late 1943, it was flown to Washington National Airport and displayed as a war trophy. Crowds lined up to see it. The aircraft that had terrorized Allied forces for 2 years was now sitting in an American hangar with United States Navy insignia painted on the fuselage. Newspaper photographers took pictures. The Zero was a symbol of American technological espionage and tactical adaptation. In 1944, the Zero was recalled to North Island for continued use as a training aircraft. Newly commissioned pilots flew mock combat against it before deploying to the Pacific. The lessons were always the same. Don't turn with it. Attack with speed. Exploit its weaknesses. On February 15, 1945, the Akutan Zero was destroyed in a training accident. The Zero was taxiing for takeoff at North Island when a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber lost control during landing. The Helldiver's landing gear collapsed. The aircraft skidded across the tarmac and slammed into the Zero. The Helldiver's propeller, still spinning at high speed, sliced through the Zero's fuselage like a saw. The Zero was cut nearly in half. Fuel spilled across the tarmac. Both aircraft were written off as total losses. The pilot of the Helldiver survived with minor injuries. Nobody was in the Zero at the time. But the most valuable intelligence asset of the Pacific War was gone. By then, it didn't matter. The Akutan Zero had already served its purpose. It had revealed the Zero's secrets. It had trained thousands of pilots. It had changed the air war in the Pacific. The knowledge it provided would never be lost. William Thach, the PBY pilot who spotted the Zero on July 10, 1942, survived the war. He continued flying patrol missions throughout the Aleutian campaign and later in the Central Pacific. He flew submarine patrols, search and rescue missions, and anti-shipping strikes. He retired from the Navy in 1946 with the rank of lieutenant commander. He never received official recognition for finding the Zero. His name appears in operational reports, but he was never decorated for the discovery. Thach died in 1989 at age 73. His obituary mentioned his service as a patrol pilot but made no mention of the most important discovery of his career. Albert Thach, the machinist mate who first saw the Zero from the window of Thach's PBY, went on to serve in the Pacific through the end of the war. He participated in numerous patrol and rescue operations. After the war, he returned to his home state of Michigan and worked as an automotive mechanic. He rarely talked about spotting the Zero. To him, it was just another patrol flight. He'd seen plenty of crashed aircraft. He had no idea this one would change history. Thach died in 1994 at age 78. Robert Kerms, who led the first recovery team and gave Koga a burial on Akutan, continued serving in the burial, Pacific. He participated in amphibious operations in the Gilbert Islands and the Marianas. He was promoted to lieutenant commander and served as a salvage operations officer. After the war, he worked in commercial shipping. Kerms never knew the full impact of the Zero he'd helped recover. To him, it was just one of many salvage operations he'd conducted during the war. He died in 2001 at age 86. Eddie Sanders, the test pilot who flew the Akutan Zero on its first American flight, continued his distinguished career. He flew combat missions in the Pacific, testing new aircraft and training pilots. After the war, he stayed in the Navy and rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. He served in anti-submarine warfare development during the Cold War, working on tactics and technology to counter Soviet submarines. Sanders rarely discussed the Akutan Zero publicly. The test flights remained classified for years. When historians finally interviewed him in the 1980s, Sanders described the Zero as a remarkable aircraft at low speeds but with obvious limitations at high speeds. He said American pilots could exploit those limitations easily once they understood what they were. Sanders died in 1998 at age 87. Melvin Hoffman, who conducted the dogfighting demonstrations, also became a rear admiral. He trained hundreds of pilots in anti-zero tactics throughout the war. After the war, he served in various command positions and helped develop jet fighter tactics during the transition from propeller to jet aircraft. Hoffman credited the captured Zero with being one of the most valuable training tools the Navy had during the Pacific War. He said seeing the Zero's weaknesses in actual flight was worth 1,000 intelligence reports. Hoffman died in 2003 at age 87. John Thach, who developed the beam defense position that became known as the Thach Weave, rose to full admiral. He continued refining fighter tactics throughout the war. When the Japanese resorted to kamikaze attacks in late 1944, Thach developed the Big Blue Blanket Defense System, a layered fighter patrol system that provided effective protection against suicide aircraft. After the war, Thach served as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air and later as Commander-in-Chief of United States Naval Forces Europe. He retired in 1967. When asked about the most important tactical development of the Pacific War, Thach always mentioned the captured Zero. He said the Zero had been a mystery before Akutan. After Akutan, it was just another airplane with known characteristics and exploitable weaknesses. Thach died in 1981 at age 76. Tadayoshi Koga's body remained buried on Akutan Island until 1947. The American Graves Registration Service conducted a systematic search of battlefield and crash site burials throughout the Pacific. They found Koga's grave on the Kogas, Akutan, and exhumed his remains. His body was reburied at a Thach Island cemetery, further down the Aleutian chain, alongside other Japanese war dead recovered from the region. In 1953, the Thach cemetery was excavated. 236 Japanese bodies were repatriated to Japan. 13 were identified by name. The remaining 223, including Koga, were reinterred as unknown soldiers at Chidorigafuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo. Koga's family never learned what happened to him. They knew only that he'd been killed in action near the Aleutians. They had no body to bury, no grave to visit. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers determined Koga's final resting place. In 1988, American author Jim Reardon and Japanese businessman Minoru Kawamoto conducted research into Koga's fate. They found the original burial site on Akutan, now empty. They traced the records through the Graves Registration Service and determined Koga's body had been among the unidentified remains repatriated in 1953. Reardon later wrote the definitive account of the Akutan Zero, documenting the full story of the aircraft's capture and impact on the war. Japanese historians learned about the Akutan Zero's role decades after the war ended. Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya of the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, a former Imperial Navy pilot and military historian, studied the intelligence failure. He concluded that the acquisition of the Akutan Zero was no less serious a blow to Japan than the defeat at the Battle of Midway. He wrote that the loss of one intact Zero had cost Japan hundreds of pilots and thousands of lives because American pilots learned to counter every advantage the Zero possessed. The Akutan Zero has been described by military historians as a prize almost beyond value to the United States and probably one of the greatest intelligence prizes of the Pacific War. Small pieces of the Akutan Zero still exist in museums. William Leonard, an aviation machinist who witnessed the 1945 collision that destroyed the aircraft, salvaged several gauges and instruments from the wreckage before it was hauled away. He kept them for decades, then donated them to the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington District of Columbia. The gauges are displayed in a case with a small placard explaining their origin. The Alaska Heritage Museum in Anchorage has fragments of aluminum skin and a piece of the control stick. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum has additional small pieces, including part of the instrument panel, but most of the Akutan Zero was scrapped in 1945. No complete airframe exists anywhere. Only fragments and photographs remain as physical evidence of the aircraft that changed the Pacific War. There is a photograph in the San Diego Air and Space Museum archives showing Eddie Sanders taxiing the Zero on September 20th, 1942, just before its first test flight. The aircraft looks pristine in the photograph. Fresh paint, American markings clearly visible. The rising sun insignia replaced with white stars on blue circles. Sanders is visible in the cockpit, his face serious and focused. Around the aircraft stand mechanics and guards, watching history about to take flight. Another photograph in the National Archives shows the Zero being lifted out of the bog on Akutan Island in July 1942. Navy personnel stand around the aircraft, which is still caked in mud. The tail is pointing skyward. Cables are rigged under the fuselage. The photograph captures the moment when the most valuable intelligence asset of the Pacific War was finally freed from the Aleutian bog that had held it for 36 days. That is how intelligence victories actually happen in war. Not through elaborate spy networks, though those matter. Not through code breaking, though that changes battles. Sometimes it's just a pilot flying off course in weather too thick to navigate. A machinist mate looking out a window at exactly the right moment. A damaged aircraft attempting an emergency landing on an island nobody cared about, and two enemy pilots who couldn't bring themselves to destroy their friend's aircraft. Koga's wingmen, Endo and Shikada, violated direct orders when they left the Zero intact on Akutan. They knew the consequences. They'd been briefed on the importance of destroying any Zero that fell into enemy hands. They knew an intact Zero in American hands would be catastrophic for Japan's war effort. But they couldn't strafe an aircraft that might contain their living comrade. That moment of compassion, that fundamentally human decision, cost Japan the air superiority it had maintained since December 1941. One intact Zero. One test pilot's methodical analysis. One series of training demonstrations. And suddenly, American pilots possessed complete knowledge. They understood the Zero's strengths and could avoid them. They understood the Zero's weaknesses and could exploit them. They knew the exact airspeeds where the Zero became vulnerable. They knew which direction to roll when escaping. They knew how to use negative G-forces to disable a pursuing Zero's engine. They transformed from victims into hunters. The Zero never recovered from that intelligence loss. It remained Japan's primary fighter through the end of the war, but only because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to design, test, and mass-produce a replacement. By 1945, the Zero was obsolete. Not because Japanese engineers failed to improve it, but because American pilots knew too much about it. They had studied the instruction manual. They had learned every secret, and they used that knowledge to dominate the skies over the Pacific for the final 3 years of the war. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one reveals how individuals, often acting on instinct or compassion, changed the course of history. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans every continent, from those who remember these events to those discovering them for the first time. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.